right. We talked about this a bit already. Egyptian history is a total mess, and that makes it really hard to figure out when certain things happened. That's on the Egyptian side. They will come up with these numbers for things that are all over the place, and we just have to kind of live with it. When I mention dates, I'm just generally presenting what people say that the dates might be rather than ascribing any authority to them myself. I also realized I forgot to put a correction in here. 2 weeks ago, when I was talking about this, I kept reversing 15th and 13th century BC because it's backwards. It grows the further back you go because we're moving away from zero. And so I was getting my 200 years in the wrong direction. Why didn't the Pharaoh care about Joseph and what Joseph had done to build the wealth of Egypt during the time of the famine? Likely because there was a dispute of whether this was an Egyptian versus a Hyksos. If it was the Hyksos that Joseph had gotten along with and built the wealth for, then when an Egyptian Pharaoh comes in, it makes perfect sense that he's mad at Joseph. You made life easier for the bad guys. There is lots of stonework in Egypt. We've seen that already in some of the pictures that they build with stone quite a bit. Of course, when we're looking at the Israelites in captivity, they're building with brick. Brick is what the Old Testament says. The Israelites are in the northern Egypt area. This is called Goshen. That's where the mouth of the Nile spreads out, and there is a lot of fertile ground in this area. It was one of the best places that they could be protected and to grow as a people. And we have Moses has entered the scene, and he has killed an Egyptian. Pharaoh didn't like that, and so Moses flees for his life, going over to Midian, where his future father-in-law Jethro lives, and we saw a little bit of that architecture last week. So Moses, where he started from is a bit of a question. I've just looked at it from the Cairo for the purposes if I had to pick somewhere. May as well look there. And okay, I see this. So harder to get Google to tell you a direction for something like this. It's an unusual travel, and you basically doesn't even have a route you could go by foot. It assumes a boat crossing the water there, so the only way they'll even give you a route is by car. But for informational purposes, 581 miles for this trip. That's a reasonable approximation. Moses is traveling by foot. Obviously, he's not going to go very fast, but 10 to 15 to 20 miles a day wouldn't be terribly crazy. Is he going to a city that's named Midian, or is he going to an area? Again, we're not going to have a lot of cities at this point in time, and the cities that we have aren't going to be very large. But he goes to a well because everybody has to go to the water at some point. And Moses may have been to the south. It may not have been Cairo. There's also a good argument that it may have been closer to Memphis. Also, he's near Israelites, so there's an argument he may have been further north. He may have been up in the Goshen area. Hard to say. Just got to pick somewhere to get an approximate thing. And it's only talking a couple days travel difference. So in terms of looking at how far he went to get away from Pharaoh, I think this still captures it pretty well. And then we get to a formative experience of Moses' life when he's at the burning bush. We see this in Exodus 3. Meanwhile, Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. Leading the flock behind in the wilderness, he came to a mountain of God, Horeb. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him as fire flaming out of a bush. Now, this is going to be one of the more disputed locations. We don't have a definitive reason to say that this one place is absolutely conclusively it, because you're talking about a bush on a mountain that doesn't exactly narrow it down. But there is a theory that this is the Mount Sinai. This is going to be the same place where the Ten Commandments happened, and we've already seen it. That is one of the theories. Horeb means dryness or devastation. So this would not be a wonderful, beautiful land, or else everybody would be living in it. This is probably a rough terrain that Moses is just looking for enough for these flocks. And it's possible, so Midian would be on this side of the sea. This is over in the Sinai Peninsula. Now, if that's what Moses has done, he's gone up over the sea and come down here. But there is a reason that might make sense, and that's because he's going to areas he knows. Moses came from that way to this way, and he's gone from this way, possibly back this way. He's retracing his steps to, oh yeah, I know where there's some stuff we can graze on, and there aren't that many people. There's a certain logic that helps support the position that it is Mount Sinai. We've looked at what's known as Mount Sinai today before. Of course, it's modern in Egypt. It's dry, very inland now. There's additional reasons that this place may make sense, but we're not going to see that until the Exodus. So I'm just going to put a pin in it and say there's another reason why you might bring flocks this way. On Mount Sinai, this dates back to the part of the burning bush. So the belief that this was the burning bush, this was the Ten Commandments, led people to build a chapel here. And this is a look at that chapel, which is called the Chapel of St. Helen. This is one of the possible locations. Modern day, it is in Egypt. This, in 380 AD, there were monks at this chapel who made an appeal to Constantine's mother. And I mentioned her one other time. Constantine became the emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the world. He did that on the belief that he was chosen by God to be the emperor, that God gave him the victory, and he was absolutely a believer. That doesn't mean he was a perfect Christian by any stretch. I'm not going to hold him out as a great example to anybody. I'm just going to say, in his mind, he was 100% convinced that the Lord we know was the Lord. I think that's a very fair way to put it. So his mother becomes a believer as well, and she goes on what we would call a pilgrimage. She wants to see all these places that are in the Bible. They wouldn't have a single book of the Bible like we would know it now. They're very close to assembling that, however, and all of those individual books are circulated at this time. I mentioned my translations class earlier, and this was one of the topics I got to was, well, how do you determine what you're actually translating? How do you determine what's in the Bible? And short version is how many places had a copy of it. The more places have a copy of Matthew and they're all the same, that's a pretty good indication that the book of Matthew is correct. Of course, the Septuagint has already been translated into Greek by this point. So all of these Old Testament places, that is in one book. They have that already. So she sees all these places mentioned. Where was Jesus? Where was Moses? Where were these things? She wants to see them for herself. And she's in the Holy Land right around this 380 AD mark, and she's looking at these places. And honestly, I would say that's probably where a lot of our knowledge or reasonable speculation comes from, is when the emperor's mother asks you where something is, there is an incentive to give her an answer. So the monks asked for help to support this chapel, and Constantine's mother gives it to them. So there is this chapel. It is still there. You can visit this place. It is St. Helen's Chapel. It exists on Mount Sinai, and that is their website. So if you ever wanted to look it up, There's the Sinai Monastery. And it is, of course, to us, one of the possible locations for the burning bush that might be on that mountain. God has called Moses. He was at the burning bush. We have gone through everything where Moses says, I'm not a great speaker. Please send somebody else. God says, Aaron's going to go with you. You've got me. That's the part Moses is having a little bit of trouble with, is you have the person who created speech on your side telling you to go do this thing. And Moses is a little slow to accept it, but he finally does. He surrenders himself to God's will, and he's going to go to Pharaoh. And the short version is he's going to say, let God's people go. In Exodus 5, we see, afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what the Lord, God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. When I copy and paste, we lose formatting, but generally speaking, when we see Lord, we're talking about the proper name in Hebrew, where it's the YW8. What am I forgetting? I was trying to think of the 4 letters. It translates to Jehovah, but in the Hebrew, it's the 4 letters because they don't write the vowels. But that's what they're translating as Lord. So it's Yahweh, but I was trying to think of what the letters actually were. Well, they don't do the vowels. It would all be consonants. In any event. So we understand what we're talking about. We're talking about the formal name of God. We're talking about Jehovah God. That's who Pharaoh is saying, I don't know who that is. This is a pagan society. It believes in a lot of different gods. There's Osiris, there's Ra, there's Seth. They've got this whole convoluted system that they have come up with for gods in Egypt. And when Moses is coming in and saying, this God says you need to let his people go, Pharaoh is answering, I don't even know who that is. That isn't one of the important ones. And he says, who is this that I should obey him? This isn't, I know who the God of the sun is. I know who the God of the Nile is. I know who the God of life and death is. Who's this other person? Why should I even care what they think? That's the perspective Pharaoh is taking when he's answering Moses and says, I will not let them go. Which is a direct challenge to the authority of God. And as you might imagine, that's not going to end well for Pharaoh. So the people of Israel are up here in Goshen, as we've talked about, and Moses is asking to bring the people east. First, they have to be freed from Egypt, and I took this map from BibleHistory.com. The nice thing about this is it kind of lays out the route of the Exodus for us. So, spoilers on some of the directions we're going in, sure, but in general, they're going to go down through Mount Sinai, then up towards the Promised Land. And that has a bunch of nice labels on it. We get to the point where Moses has refused to listen when he was asked. Moses has already performed miracles. We've got the staff turning into a snake. We've got the Egyptian sorcerers somehow repeating it. We've had all that dramatic stuff so far. Pharaoh will still not let the Israelites go. And now God is going to show what he can really do. And he's going to prove absolute supremacy over all of what Pharaoh thinks the gods are and what he thinks they control. With the plagues, God is systematically going to show you, no, I'm in charge of this. I'm in charge of the sun. I'm going to make it go black. I'm in charge of the Nile. I'm going to turn it to blood. I'm in charge of the fertility of the ground. I'm going to send locusts to wipe it out. I am in charge of life and death. I'm going to take the life of every firstborn in Egypt. God is proving his absolute authority over everything that this Pharaoh does not think he has authority over. I'm not going to look over all the plagues, which is why I just kind of gave that summary of them. But I do want to look at a couple just to get a flavor of what we're talking about and how God is protecting his people during this time. So in chapter 7 of Exodus, then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is unyielding. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he goes out to the river. Confront him on the bank of the Nile. Take in your hand the staff that was changed into a snake. Then say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to say to you, let my people go, so that they may worship me in the wilderness. But until now, you have not listened. This is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish of the Nile will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink of its water. So this begs the question, where is Pharaoh when Moses is confronting him? And this is another classic case of we've got two definite maybes. So I'm going to look at both of them, and with the ever-present disclaimer that Egyptian history is a mess, I can't point to you at a time frame and definitively say this is the capital of Egypt where Pharaoh would obviously be, so this is what makes the most sense.
Yeah, I just mention something real quick.
Go ahead.
You think about his history being a mess. I mean, we today, for a good part, understand our history in this country because it was well established, it was written down, it was taught. Mm-hmm. To think that there was a Pharaoh who either didn't know, if we think of it from the perspective of had no knowledge of, or just disregarded Joseph. If the history is a mess, you can see where it could be either way.
Yeah.
But there was still this people in Goshen that is still thriving up there apparently, and so the Pharaoh would have to have some knowledge of who these people are, but he just disregards it, I guess.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think about that because we're so steeped in our history. I think that a country like Egypt even would ignore or not value their history.
Yeah. One of the things history that we do have written down tells us is slavery has been a pretty consistent battle for a long time, and it still goes on in our day now, which is where you can start to see where things get lost to history. When we don't even talk about the slavery that's happened now, in 100 years from now, who's going to know much about it? Because we weren't even talking about it to write it down much. But Pharaoh is seeing a lot of slave labor in the north. He's using them to build these great architectural things. Peeking ahead a little bit, we're going to talk about some of the things that may exist at this time. We've already looked at the first pyramid might already be built by the time of Joseph. Those things are harder to pin down because the method of dating isn't reliable. And the Bible's not talking about these monuments that Egyptians built. They don't have anything to do with God, so they're not important. But the Egyptians, the Israelites, are being used as slave labor. They're being used as slave labor to make bricks. They're probably helping build a lot of the ancient Egyptian cities that we'll see later because, again, a ton of stonework. So where is Moses confronting Pharaoh was the question. We've got the long Nile River, of course. Amhos the First is credited with expelling the Hyksos. So we know the Hyksos are involved at some point of the correlation of Egyptian Israelite history. they're on one side of it or the other. We know that for sure. That's going to be one of the disputed parts when you're talking about the 200 years difference. But this is the Pharaoh who's credited with taking the Hyksos out of the north. His tomb has two possible locations. They're pretty much near each other. They're further south of on the Nile. And the first one is Abydos in Egypt. And that's the spot we've marked here. So looking at what it might be with Abydos, I've used Cairo as a reference point. It's handy. It's modern, easy to find on a map. So it's a good reference point for us, even if it wasn't that big of a deal back then. But if you went from Abydos, which is one of our two possible capital locations that Moses has gone to confront Pharaoh, to Cairo, we're talking 312 miles. So the separation here from where Pharaoh is to where the Israelites are is dramatic. And what this tells me is it's one of the reasons why a plague down here isn't necessarily a plague up here. God has used this separation between Pharaoh and the Israelites to shield them from his wrath and proving his authority over Pharaoh and over Egypt. God's pretty smart about these things, isn't he? Now, that's not the only way he can do it, but it is a way that he can do it. Abydos. The tombs at Abydos are about 10 miles from the Nile River proper. They've built up a tomb structure, a temple structure. It was a little further inland. That's a rough picture of what it looks like. Again, a lot of stonework in Egypt. Internally, it just looks very Egyptian. Like any Egyptian exhibit you ever see, it looks exactly like that. Abydos was a tomb of the pharaohs. Now, the English name that we have for this, it comes from Greek. Greeks go there, they're going to name it something. It's also near a fairly major city of Al-Balania, which is a population of over 500,000. So a very significant location. And generally, this area is pretty fertile because of its proximity to the Nile. So I've got a great map for that. I don't know if we get to today, but it's tremendous for showing off how the population of Egypt is just all along the Nile. We're talking about, I would guesstimate, over 90% of Egypt's population lives along the Nile. As big as it is on a map, it is a very concentrated population to be near the water. Abydos was home of the cult of Osiris. I mentioned that Pharaoh, when he's using Yahweh God, when he's using the proper name and saying, I don't know who that is, this is who he knows. He knows Osiris. He knows the Egyptian pantheon, the false gods that they've come up with. Osiris has power over fertility, agriculture, the afterlife, the dead, resurrection, and life, and worship would be at the great temple of Abydos. So if this is where Moses is confronting Pharaoh and saying, let God's people go, this is what Pharaoh thinks is on his side. And this is exactly what God says, nope, that's mine. I'm the one with authority over these things. The city we mentioned, it's near El-Balania. That's a 160 square kilometers city. For reference point, I decided to look at what Sarasota is. It's officially measured at 62.38 square miles for Sarasota proper, if ever you are curious. So not quite 3 times the size, but pretty close to it. So pretty big. But interestingly, in area, it would not be one of the top 150 cities in the America. I looked at a list because I was curious where it would rank, and the 150th city is still bigger. So this is a site where Coptic Christians are very present. About 5 to 15% of Egypt's population. I don't know how they estimate it, so I don't know how they get this range. But the Coptic Christians are very present in this area. It's also an area of agriculture. They've got 550,000 acres of agriculture. They grow yams, onions, and sugarcane. This area is about 6% of Egypt's farmland, or at least intentional farmland, where somebody's actively maintaining it. Then I was really curious about another area. I was specifically going to look at Plant City and see how many acres of strawberry fields we had for contrast. But when I looked up strawberries, for all of Florida, it's estimated there are 13,000 acres of strawberry fields in the state of Florida. And that's a lot of strawberries, isn't it? And this is about 50 times larger. That's a lot of farmland. So it gives us a character of what the place is, and also that much farmland is going to require a pretty significant population to work the land. Now, the other location that Pharaoh may have been in is Memphis. Memphis is northern of Abydos. It's the old capital of Egypt. It's very significant to their history. There's a lot of ruins nearby. It's near Mount Rahina. It's near the Giza Pyramids complex. So the Great Pyramids, you're talking just over to the west here. And it's estimated that during the Old Kingdom period of Egypt, there would have been about 6,000 people living here in Memphis. So it's not a large city by our standards, but that would probably be pretty typical for the time. It'd be mostly administrative. This isn't the agriculture area like we just saw. This is a city. Cities don't have a lot going for them at the time. You don't have running water yet. So just add that aspect in and think about how many people you want to live around when you don't have running water. It's going to be a significantly smaller. Yeah. Interestingly, just because it's probably the most famous bit of architecture in Egypt, the Sphinx would be over here. It would be in this west of Memphis area. And it is dated by people who say these things to about 2500 BC. I found that interesting because that means it exists in the era we're talking about. If you accept that as correct, that means the Israelites can see the Sphinx if they're ever traveling through that region. Did Moses see the Sphinx? I don't know, probably not. Did Joseph ever see the Sphinx? There's a decent chance. On the other hand, this may have been in the lower kingdom. This may not have been the area that Joseph was in. But it's close enough, and it is close enough in time, that it is a chance that someone in this era would actually see the Sphinx at some point. Not that it would be a particularly big deal to them. So it's like, why write it down? That's nothing. That's just some crazy thing the Egyptians built out in the desert. Mount Rahina. This is near the Memphis area. There's a mix. There's some greenery here. You can see this is a more modern picture. It's also the burial place of Alexander the Great. So one of history's most influential worldly figures. He's a military conqueror who's going to be everywhere. And in 323 BC, his body is brought here by Ptolemy the First. And Ptolemy was one of Alexander's great generals. He's got 4 great generals. Ptolemy is one of them. Ptolemy is the one who takes the Egyptian part of the empire of Alexander the Great when he passes away. It's not exactly quartered, but it's roughly quartered. 4 major areas of influence. And Ptolemy is the one who's in Egypt. And he is the ancestor of another name you probably have heard of, Cleopatra. Cleopatra was a Greek. She was a Ptolemy, and this is where she came from. So just to tie into some interesting historical events for this location and some of the reasons we think it may have been either one of those two locations that Pharaoh may have been and where Moses was thus confronting Pharaoh when all these plagues are happening. So mapping out the distance between these locations, showing us the gap here between Pharaoh and the Israelites. This is close enough that information can easily travel. This is, what's it say, 20 hours? It's too small on my screen. You could walk this. This is a day or two trip, probably by camel. So messages would get relayed through here all the time, but it's not somewhere where you're looking out and seeing what's going on over there. So it's also far enough that things are different. And of course, we've had hurricanes be a serious influence here the last few years, as everyone is well aware. But you can go about 30 minutes by car in one direction or the other on many of these storms and see a completely different scenery. Sarasota might be without power and it's hard to get gas, but if you go a little bit north, all of a sudden they've got power, they've got gas. The roads didn't get as affected as much. It's a little easier to travel around. So even places that are reasonably close in proximity can have wildly different outcomes from a natural disaster as big and as powerful as a hurricane. So when you were talking about these plagues, just even a little separation like this can make all the difference in how it affects people. And long before this Pharaoh was in power, some 400 years before we're talking about this point, God brought his people to a place that would keep them safe. God is really, really smart. And finally, after the conclusion of the plagues with the firstborn, the Exodus is going to begin in earnest. Pharaoh has had enough in Exodus 12. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, says, "Up, lead my people, you Israelites, you and your Israelites. Go worship your God as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go and also bless me." Now, Pharaoh is not a believer. This did not convert him, but he has come to realize and humble himself that he really is dealing with God and a God who has power over him. In Exodus, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, and we'll see that on the next map. Though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road towards the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. He said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones with you from this place. This is around 100 years or so from the passing of Joseph. You probably don't have anyone alive who knew Joseph, but you would have had the children of people who did, at least according to one timeline. So instead of going this direct route where the Philistines are powerful along the coast, God is going to take them across the Red Sea. He's going to take them south towards Mount Sinai. This was the BibleHistory.com map. It's consistent with what other sources say as well. The Israelites are not going the direct route. They're traveling by foot. And that's also worth remembering. Because, if you were going by boat, you'd want to go up this way and you'd be there in a few days. you would probably do skips and get there in a couple weeks, but by boat, you'd be getting there much faster. Pharaoh, of course, is going to chase them. Yeah, I think we're okay. We'll make this the last point. Pharaoh is going to chase after the Israelites. He wants his slave labor back in Exodus 14. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth between Midgal and the sea. They are encamped by the sea directly opposite Baal-zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed by the desert." Now, you have a little bit of contention over where the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, and it's premised on the idea, is this the Red Sea, or is all of this the Red Sea? I think that is time. I'll say for next week, I may set this aside because I have another idea in mind that would be fun if I can put it together, but I don't want to order for promise and under-deliver. Either way, the current plan is I'll wrap up the year the next 2 weeks, and then we're in Craig's good hands, and we'll see what he has for us. So thank